So, Matt, you call your book a libertarian manifesto. Explain what libertarianism is, specifically how it relates with conservatism.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about that now, and we debated with the publisher whether or not to put the L word on the cover. But so many people are asking the question now, what is a libertarian? And there's this argument supposedly between libertarians and conservatives and neocons and Tea Partiers and fill in the blank. There's all these silos that we're apparently in. And I don't think there is a fundamental difference if you understand conservatism properly defined. There is a fundamental difference between what I would call big government conservatism, the idea that you would take the power of the state and impose a certain set of behaviors on people, either subsidize them or punish them. That sounds a lot like progressivism to me, and I think that the real political spectrum on one side has liberty and individual responsibility and community solving problems, and on the other hand has this supposedly beneficent state and really smart bureaucrats redesigning things from the top down.
So when you cite Hayek writing Why I Am Not a Conservative, do you think he had a different definition of conservative than the contemporary definition or than Ronald Reagan's definition?
Oh, very much so, very much so. And Hayek was talking about the tendency in Europe to use government to really control and dictate and redesign people's lives. And of course, in Europe, even today, a liberal is closer to what we would call a conservative. It's more libertarian, it's classical liberal. So one of the things that's happened in the United States is that the left steals all of our best words. They stole liberal, they stole community, and when I mention that I'm a community organizer, I get jeers from the crowd. But that's who we are. That's what the Boston Tea Party was.
And well, you appropriate Saul Alinsky's rules for radicals, so make your 6 rules for libertarians. I wanted to walk through some of them. The first is don't hurt people. That's the title of the book. Explain why that is rule number 1.
I wanted to take the fundamental principle of voluntary cooperation is you don't mess with other people, you don't threaten them, you don't hurt them, and you expect them to treat you the same way. Libertarians have this fancy term, the non-aggression principle. And if you're really in the know and you know the secret handshake, you don't even say that, you say the nap. Because we love to chase people out of the room. But it's common sense, and you wouldn't have civilized society without that. It's also important to understand that big government, the experiments in big government, they're not theoretical. This is not stuff off of chalkboards. We know what happens when you give governments too power, whether it's fascism or communism or any sort of ism, radical Islams, any third world dictator that uses religion or some rationale to control people. It leads to a lot of people dying at the hands of the state. I think we need to appreciate, like the founders did, big government is dangerous, power is dangerous, it needs to be kept in a very locked cage.
And it's part of the libertarian talk of the non-aggression principle to say that government is force and the threat of force. Didn't Alan Greenspan say something like under every pile of regulations, ultimately there's a gun? And you can point to, Mao or Pol Pot, but in America today, do we really feel like if the government is saying, you know what, you have to buy more efficient light bulbs, or you know what, your tax rate is going to be 15% on your marginal dollar, is that really violence? Is that really hurting people? Or isn't that just sort of doing things together, as Barney Frank says?
Well, it is forcing people to do things they wouldn't do otherwise, and not complying is enforced literally at the point of a gun. You don't get to choose whether or not you pay your taxes, even though the IRS talks about voluntary compliance. There's nothing voluntary about it. There's nothing voluntary about complying with EPA regulations or frankly any bureaucratic dictate. Now, it is different in the United States because being forced to use a lousy light bulb is hardly a fundamental act of oppression. But if you go to Europe, particularly Eastern Europe, and go to someplace like Lithuania or the country of Georgia and talk to people there, they remember seeing their family members shot in the street by the government. That's different. And in a sense, Americans don't appreciate what big government's all about because the way that it operates in this country is typically more benign.
Well, and the liberal pushback would be, but aren't they different in kind? Isn't the oppressive communist bloc dictatorship, or just any dictatorship, different in kind than the United States? That it's not even it's not a question of degree. It really is different.
It's a question of size, actually, and it's hard to imagine an omnipotent government that's not hurting people and taking their stuff, and history would back that up. That's why the founders were for limited government. They weren't for good government or bad government. They said we can either limit this power or we can have unlimited power. And unlimited power always leads to really bad, unintentional consequences. Maybe the rationale for big government is a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's wrapped in the language of compassion, but in practice it doesn't work out that way.
The other half of the title, Don't Take Their Stuff. This is based on an idea of property rights. Now, isn't that ultimately based on government? We don't have property unless either you're standing on the border of your farm with a shotgun or the police are willing to protect your property rights. So are we just stepping away from anarchism, or how does it work with libertarianism to put such an emphasis on property?
Yeah, and this goes back to certainly our founding as well. It was life, liberty, and property, and those things were not in any way fundamentally distinct from each other. Frederick Hayek would argue that the evolution of common law comes out of people doing things together that work. And it happens over time. There's a reason why you drive on a certain side of the road. There's a reason why you don't take other people's stuff and why you don't hurt them. And those are what a lot of conservatives and libertarians would call natural laws. I'm not sure Hayek would say it quite that way. Conservatives and libertarians believe that a limited government, the proper role of government, should be in defense of life, liberty, and property, but nothing else. And obviously we've gotten beyond that. But in a lot of ways, those rules that government enforces are codified versions of what civil society developed because it worked.
You have 4 more rules. The third rule is take responsibility. Say more about that.
I hate the president's straw man about community. In Rolling Stone magazine, mm-hmm. he takes a shot at Ayn Rand and basically creates a straw man. Either you believe in the individual, like Ayn Rand did, and those of us that read Ayn Rand did, or you believe in robust community, and you can't have both. And he says when you grow up, you start to realize that it's not all about you. You can't do whatever you want. That's such a straw man. I think individual freedom that I get from Rand is all about responsibility. It's not a blank check to do whatever you want. It's the responsibility you get when you look in the mirror trying to figure out, did you get it done? Did you take responsibility? If you don't, who's going to do it for you? That's the basis of what makes up for community. People solving problems, people coming together. And when you outsource that responsibility to government, like Barney Frank says we should, government's what we do together, is what he says. I think that unwinds community. I think it unravels the fabric that holds us all together because it's an excuse not to take responsibility.
So, but if you take the responsibility, say, to care for the poor, to feed the hungry and clothe the naked and house the homeless, if you take that away from the government, does it fall onto the individual? Do you, Matt Kibbe, have a responsibility to feed a hungry person, to help the poor people?
I think you do. And I think that our evidence in the United States and our evidence in communities that have been left free shows that that's exactly what happens when free people are left to solve problems. You care a lot about your community. It's harder to care about something that's 3,000 miles away or even 6 countries away. It should happen from the bottom up. Once you outsource that to a third party, even if it's a voluntary organization, but particularly if it's a government organization, somebody else's agenda comes in, and you don't know who needs help and who's gaming the system. That's why local works so well. And
you suggested in the book, and you just suggested now, that in fact when the government steps in, it erodes the civil society aspects of community and actually weakens sort of neighborliness and charity.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Oh, absolutely. And you see it happen every day on the ground. You saw it happen with George W. Bush's faith-based initiative, which I would call a classic example of big government conservatism. All of these well-meaning people that were trying to solve problems voluntarily at the local level stopped doing what they were doing and started lobbying for an earmark. And this is what happens when you outsource it. It shifts the incentives, and there's always a middleman that gets the payout. And I would argue that it's never really been about transferring money from the rich to the poor. It's about transferring money